I'd like to introduce Ramon Kemp, Vice President and Head of Oncology Early Development at GSK. We're going to be discussing innovating for equitable outcomes and the priorities for those and industry's role in those. So welcome, Ramon. Thank you. Great. Ramon. So let's get straight into it. I mean, maybe we can talk about, we see acceleration in innovation and really quite some transformative innovations. I know in particular your field will be in medicines, but yet we still see a lot of inequity in comparable countries, in peer countries, and within peer countries. So what do you see as industry's role in addressing that aspect of it, the innovating for equitable outcomes, as the title suggests?
Yeah, great, thank you. First, just thanks everybody for the invitation. Really happy to be here. Really happy to share our views of how we can improve health equity. I think that there's health inequity is multifaceted, and I think that industry has a role in many different areas. One of which is just around disease awareness, disease prevention, understanding why certain individuals understand how to access health care and why others don't. I think industry certainly has a role in making sure that we communicate and interact with all of our advocacy organizations, social groups, et cetera, to make sure that they understand this. I think also for an innovation piece, our healthcare system right now is really kind of at a brink where many people don't have access to drugs, and drugs don't always work on all of the patients, right? So we know that, I'm blanking out on that. So we know that certain drugs work on certain people and other drugs don't. We understand that clinical trials are an important source to get information for why a patient may respond or why a patient may not respond. We know that in different tissue samples that we collect on our clinical trials will help us to understand the genetic alterations that exist with some patients that may allow them to respond and not with other patients. But in clinical trial enrollment is really at an all-time low. When we think about different disparate groups that don't have access to health care and aren't enrolling in clinical trials, it's essentially a sample set that we're not able to study. So we're generating drugs on a patient population that doesn't completely represent all of the patients who are at risk. So one of the key things that we're trying to do at GSK is to really educate our overall population so that individuals know clinical trials are a way of, one, having access to novel medicines, but two, a way of allowing us to study the broad population that can actually be at risk for these drugs. The better we're able to do that, the better we're able to really design drugs that really work with more patients than we have right now. So that's a really important initiative that we have, certainly at GSK and across the industry. We know that other government agencies are really mandating this, and so we want to make sure that our physicians understand that that's needed. There's a few barriers as to why this is the case. I mean, some of this is just because patients don't know that these clinical trials exist. There are also long-standing concerns that patients might have about enrolling in clinical trials. They just don't understand and they don't necessarily trust that these clinical trials are going to benefit them. So those are some barriers that we just have to break down to educate patients so they understand that there's benefits to enrolling in clinical trials, not only for potential health benefits, but also just so that we can better study and understand the disease in different patient populations. I think industry has a big role in this piece as well, though. We can do a lot better at making sure that we're educating the physicians that are included in these clinical trials. I mean, this is where the patients have the trust. The most trust is with their physicians. It's important that we have a good conversation with physicians so that they understand that they should offer these clinical trials to patients. It's also important that we go to where the patients are to have these clinical trials conducted as well. I mean, oftentimes we'll use larger academic centers to enroll these clinical trials, which certainly can benefit from company standpoint, that you have a larger patient population, bigger throughput, et cetera. But that's not always where all of the at-risk patients are. I mean, there's communities and community centers and hospitals that have patients that could be included in clinical trials, but they're just not because clinical trials aren't placed there. And so there's really a responsibility of companies to ensure that we're going into the community, and in doing that, that we're training physicians as to how to conduct these clinical trials so that they can have these conversations with their patients and have the patients enrolled in the clinical trials. So there's a lot that's needed to make sure that we get the right data set, if you will, and that we're generating drugs not only for kind of the broader population that may be currently enrolled in clinical trials, but we're generating drugs that are really tailored towards each at-risk patient.
Right. And if, are you talking about sort of broadening inclusion criteria for trials, or ensuring that there's greater access to the trials that are running within the inclusion criteria that exist?
Yeah, so good question. A little bit of both, to be honest with you. I mean, the way that our trials are designed, it's important to make sure that just the inclusion-exclusion criteria doesn't inadvertently exclude certain populations. Mm-hmm. There's other ways to design the trials to ensure that some of the objectives and questions that we're asking in the trials require that you do seek out certain patient populations for inclusion in the trials so that you can meet those objectives. So part of this is just to your point, that we have a protocol that does not prevent and actually encourages broader inclusion in these clinical trials.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that there can sometimes be a tension? Because one of the reasons for having narrow inclusion criteria is you can more likely guarantee an effect size that will pass licensure, whereas if you broaden, there's a risk to that. Is that a potential issue when you're kind of considering this kind of thing?
It is, and it's not.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we really want to try to, let's say, tailor the patient population, as far as we know, unless we have firsthand knowledge that a particular subset of individuals are unlikely to respond, right. Which often is not the case when we start to think about mm-hmm. genetic differences, ethnic differences, or gender differences. It's unusual or unlikely that we have that kind of firsthand knowledge that we should exclude those patients. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a fallacy that would be the right. risk. Instead, the preference is actually to have patient-specific biomarkers mm-hmm. or patient-specific, let's say, phenotypes in addition to a protein biomarker, that you have other characteristics of patients that you can identify to select specific patient populations for inclusion in your clinical mm-hmm. trials. So I think you're spot on in that we really want to make sure that we're tailoring the trial to the patient that we think is going to respond the most. But I don't think the way you get there is by excluding certain ethnic right. or gender demographics in that. I think it's more by understanding the science, understanding the drivers of some of these tumors, and being able to test that hypothesis specifically with phenotypic biomarkers to enroll patients.
And maybe are there any specific examples you can give of how you've engaged with, say, underserved communities or with clinicians, or both, to get that broader engagement within a trial?
Yep. So a couple of different things. I mean, one of which would be some of our interactions we have with patient advocacy groups mm-hmm. To make sure that they understand our mission and they're able to connect well with patients so that patients are unafraid and, two, are aware that these trials are actually ongoing. Mm-hmm. So we have these kinds of interactions for sure. There's different foundations that we have for patient awareness. We partner with, for instance, the Tiger Lily Foundation, who generates online videos for awareness of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, different types of gynecologic cancers, and to make sure that the community is aware of the trials and aware of the diseases that they really have.
Okay. I mean, this is foreshadowing a later discussion. We're going to have a panel session on trial access and clinical trial design. Any questions from the floor? We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Any questions? I want to start early with questions. Okay, fine. Then I suppose the other question I had was, what's the, having been through the trials, and you've had a sort of broader a broader access to those trials, then ensuring what do you see as the role, and I know this may not be your direct field because you're involved in development, but what do you see as the role of industry, or what would you like to see in terms of ensuring that then is then replicated when the medicines go to market or have market access?
Yeah, so, I mean, certainly when we have an approved drug, right now we're talking about that, we certainly look to our medical and commercial colleagues to ensure that we're identifying all of the patients that could potentially have a benefit from our therapy. Regulatory guidelines, other congresses to make sure that patients understand that these medicines are available, the best populations to use these medicines, the best way to use these medicines as well. So we make sure that that's known and ensure that they have access to them as well.
And then going right the way out the other side, the upstream, in terms of identifying unmet needs and identifying those biomarkers and trying to innovate right at the beginning, maybe even from the discovery phase.
Yeah.
How do you see that in terms of the equity agenda?
Yeah, and it's part and parcel to the discussion we just had around clinical trial enrollment. I mean, it all really starts with the patient. Understanding and having patients enrolled in clinical trials allows us to get a sample size that includes patients that may respond, may not respond. We know that cancer in any homogeneous population is going to have a variety of reasons why one patient may respond and why one patient may not. And so it really starts with enrollment in clinical trials. I mean, the other thing is that, you know, we're talking about health inequities, and we're also talking about disparities in outcomes, in part due to some of the things we've highlighted here of understanding the patient. And that's really at the time when we are best positioned as an industry to make the greatest advances in the way that we're developing our medicines. I mean, never before have we had the data that's available in databases, such as we have a nice collaboration with a company called Tempest, and they have thousands of samples that are annotated well of patients' characteristics and the way that they've responded or not to therapies. We've got great groundbreaking science in terms of understanding molecular diseases and partnering that with some of the computing from AI, ML. We're able right now to better understand characteristics that lead to a beneficial outcome of patients or not. And we're also able to identify new targets of response that we can then roll back into discovery to create new medicines specifically for those patients that are enrolled in clinical trials. So right now, we're best positioned to be able to execute on this. But yet there's still this disparity of patients that are responding or not, patients who have access or not as well. So I think the best way that we can solve this is to ensure that we're doing the best science. We're partnering and collaborating with others. I mean, we have a nice collaboration with King's College that allows us to interrogate questions just around why patients respond and why they don't. Right. We've got better models right now. They've got a nice three-dimensional cellular model that allows us to better understand patient responses or not. So we've got the technology today, and we've got the ability today to really begin to execute on that. We just need to make sure that we've got a representative sample size and that we continue to collaborate well, both within our company and external as well.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a great way to start the day, so thank you very much, Ramon. We'll move on to the next discussion.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Take care.